Good evening. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I am Samantha Davidson Green, and I am a Plainfield resident. I was honored to be invited by Nancy to be an MC for tonight's program with these very distinguished speakers who are going to help us together celebrate this extraordinary stage that was designed and painted by Maxfield Parrish. And I feel such a special connection to this going back to my own childhood coming to performances here. My stepmother, Helen Taylor Davidson, was a member of this community, and when I moved back here with my children and my husband 3 years ago, we began coming to the children's theater performances here and have loved this stage set. So I also have a special connection to Maxfield Parish through an opportunity a year ago at St. Gaudens, in which I had the chance to direct Louise Saunders' play The Knave of Hearts with a lot of local children here and adult actors as well, in which we attempted to mimic Maxfield Parish's work in our stage design and costumes. So I feel very connected to these artists and just feel so honored to be here. Before we start with our honored speakers who've traveled, some from very far, to share their expertise with us, I wanted to let you know about the illustrations that are on the walls on the side. These are available for sale at the library across the street. So after the program this evening, if you have a chance to take a look, you can return to the library if you'd like to purchase a print. Nancy and her colleagues have also gone through the Historic Society archives and brought out some documents that I think might be very interesting. On this wall we have programs, playbills, things related to different performances that have happened on the stage over the last 100 years. And in the back near the cake, where we will celebrate the birthday of our wonderful set here, are photos of the restoration process that has maintained this design for us. I'd like to share a few brief words about the origins of the stage set. This building was constructed in 1798, and 118 years later, in 1916, William Howard Hart, who was one of the artists in the Cornish colony and a New York stage designer, offered to build a stage for the town if the town would have agreed to build the foundation. At the town meeting that year in March 1916, the voters accepted the offer, and this required building an addition to the back of the town hall. So behind the stage, there are two dressing rooms and a privy. Hart asked Maxfield Parrish to design the stage set, which you'll see in its entirety after we have two presentations using the screen, and then we'll be taking it down in order to see the full glory, and we will have a light show presentation. The first production that was staged here was The Woodland Princess. This was a children's play written by Louise Saunders, writer and poet and resident of Windsor, Vermont, along with her husband, Maxwell Perkins, who was the New York editor of such writers as Hemingway, Thomas Wolfe, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. The play was performed here in August of 1916, and it was between March and August of that year that the entire stage lights and curtains were installed and created. There are 4 banks of lights, yellow, blue, and red, with 325 bulbs, which perfectly complement this set, as you will have a demonstration later. All of the lighting apparatus and the weight system for lowering and raising the lights are original. They are designed to present a full scope of the day from dawn to sunset with a view of Mount Ascutney, which is so cherished to all of us in this region. The original lighting system consisted of large metal drums with levers, and when the levers were pulled, drums revolved, which allowed the lights to change. We still have those, but a modern lighting board was installed along with a new curtain 10 years ago. In 1993, the Maxfield Parish Stage Set Committee of the Historical Society raised $22,000 to have the conservators of Williamstown Regional Art Conservation Laboratory of Williamstown, Massachusetts, clean and repair the set. And as I mentioned, there are photos in the back of that restoration project. In the early years of the set, it would be taken down and put back up to accommodate other activities in the community, such as dances, other plays, basketball practice, school functions in this space. The wings can fold in half and be put in racks in the backstage, and the backdrop is not a rolling canvas, but is actually something that can be folded into a U shape and moved, and had been stored in the attic. However, as you can imagine, over time, as the precious value of this set became understood, we no longer remove this in order to make sure that it's historically preserved. And it's really quite, as your program will describe, an extraordinary opportunity to have a set that was designed before 1920 and endures to this day. There are certain rules that now preserve it, such as no touching and no food and such things. The town hall here is on the National Register of Historic Places and is included in the National List of Historic Theater Buildings. And I was particularly pleased to know that it has been known as the most beautiful stage north of Boston. I'd argue I think it's one of the most beautiful stages anywhere I've ever seen in the country. I would like to now turn to introduce our first speaker, who is my friend and neighbor, Jo Everts. She's a journalist, writer, and group leader of Osher classes at Dartmouth on the Cornish Art Colony.
If you remember just two things from what I say tonight, I hope they will be these. Number one, Cornish and the Cornish Colony began as a family group and continued through families from the time that it started through what was really its acme, which was in 1916, coincidental with the stage set. So I'd like you to think about that a bit, and I'd like you also to remember that 1916 was a watershed year for the Cornish Colony, and I will explain to you why that would be. Kat, you want to help me with the visuals, please? Thanks. This is my daughter. The slide on the left is a slide of the family, the Everts family and the Adams family. Everts was clerked in Windsor, Vermont when he was at Yale Law School, and he fell in love with a local woman whose family had been part of the first group to settle in Windsor. Windsor was a bustling center of Vermont in 1840 when he met her, clerking, and he met her at a ball at the Curtis Mansion in Windsor and proposed to her, and the night before he married her, he also stayed in the Curtis Mansion, and 3 years later, they were married in 1843, 3 years later, in 1846, he bought the Curtis Mansion. And they had 12 children. He was an important statesman in the 19th century. The fact that they had such a large family and lived both in New York and up here in the Upper Valley made for very exciting summers when they escaped the heat of New York and began a tradition of wives and children staying up in this area. On the left, you see the family group in Florence in 1872. During the Civil War, the British helped the South by making various ships, which then became ships that sank Northern Union ships. And the United States brought claims against England for their assistance to the South. This began as early as 1861 because they had sunk one of the best of the Union ships, and this was the CSS Alabama. They made claims on the British, and eventually, by the way, one of the claims they made on the British was they'd have to give them back Canada, but that didn't happen. And Everts was a statesman and a known lawyer and a judicious person by personality, and he was made head of the Alabama Claims Commission, which went to Geneva, met in Geneva for 2 years. He brought his family, and they lived in Europe for those 2 years. The Everts women had their shoes done by a shoemaker in New York whose name was St. Gaudens. And this was the sculptor's dad. He was an only child. And the Everts, especially Hetty, was very interested in St. Gaudens, the son, and his artistic ability. And in fact, Everts was a private supporter of the trip that sent St. Gaudens to France to study at the Beaux-Arts. He both drew and made sculpture from the time he was little. He went to the Beaux-Arts and learned essentially a pretty traditional classical approach to making sculpture. In 1871, when the Everts arrived there, St. Gaudens arrived in 1867, and they had been friends, the children of both, he with that family, especially Hetty Everts. And when they arrived in 1871-72, she imposed upon her father to go to Rome to see what St. Gaudens was doing. In the family, there was a very modest belief that Mr. Everts looked like Cicero. So they went to see the sculpture that he had done of Cicero, and they all agreed, oh yes, he would be able to do the father's bust, which he did, and came back to New York. It was the first bust commission that he had that was very significant, and I remember the associate curator of the American wing in New York, when they were opening the wing, came and was very eager to have the family lend the sculpture, which my husband and his brothers were happy to have happen, and now it actually is at the Metropolitan, which is pretty exciting, on the same pedestal that had been chosen by St. Gaudens that was in the library at the house until relatively recently. On the left, you see the Evertses. They came with the descendants of John Adams. They were all friends. Sometimes I think there were only about 4 families in America until 1900. And this shows Mrs. Everts, who's in the back in the middle, wearing black because one of her sons had died. And then you travel across there and you see the Everts, various Everts children. Hetty Sherman Everts, who was very interested in art herself and did painting as a hobby, met on that excursion Charles Coatsworth Beeman, who was a young lawyer in the delegation that went to bring the Alabama claims in Geneva. He was from Boston. And they returned and he courted her, and in 1874 they were married. On the right, you see one of the central galleries in the École des Beaux-Arts, where the students would show their sculpture at various points during the year. The space was very large and had other gallery spaces for painting. But this gives you an idea of the importance of the space and of the school when St. Gaudens was there. This is something, a photograph that was done in 1874. Below, just a little reminder to you that being an artist was actually pretty much a fun thing. You may notice that the fellow on the back on the right has less to say about the camera than he does about the model. And that is to remind you that the passion of artists it's a polyamorous love of all kinds of things and sensuality. In any case, these are the men looking as if they're very professional, most of them, and haven't even noticed this gorgeous woman in the back with her saucy pose. And if we go ahead one, the Académie Julian was the second academy that was started this one was started in the 19th century, and was very progressive. They allowed women to come and study there, which was exciting. You'll see in the photograph on the bottom, that is a women's drawing class, and you'll notice that, of course, they have a woman who is fully clothed for their model, and not a nude model. And St. Gaudens, the picture on the right is St. Gaudens when he was young and had headed over to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. And this below it is the Cicero that was shown when they went to visit him in Rome, that was shown to the Everts, and that they all agreed, oh yes, of course, it looks just like Dad. So the next one will show you that he did the bust on the left, which you can see is the first of his sculpture that incorporates a realism to it that is quite interesting. But the other thing about it is when you look at the tendons and you look at the neck and you look at the chest, you can see that there is an energy and importance that he has imbued the sculpture with, which helps to distinguish it, obviously, and is a lot of fun. So there is what he looked like, and boy, didn't he do a nice job with the one on the left, which, when he was in the library at Windsor, my husband had colored in the pupils with a pencil. That has since been cleaned off. On the right, you see the portrait of Hetty Everts Beeman, and on the right, you see a photograph of Elizabeth Everts Perkins, and she has on her lap Max Perkins, who is Ruth's grandfather, and this is Ruth's great-grandmother. And when we talked on the phone about this evening, Ruth said to me, well, we all look alike, don't we? So I thought you might notice that there is a certain family resemblance that seems to go on. Below is the St. Gaudens relief that was done as part of the payment. Wasn't it, John, part of the payment, that portrait? Remember, yeah. So you may remember that Beeman offered to sell him Huggins Folly the first year that they came up, but he didn't want to buy it. But then when he did want to buy it a couple of years later, he said, well, all right, I'd like a couple of portraits done in the meanwhile. The Everts, the Beeman Book of Joys and Sorrows, the original of which is up in the Rounder at Dartmouth, has the entry in their hands of Augustus and Augusta, St. Gaudens. And Augusta writes, "We almost didn't come, but we changed our minds." This is in April of 1885 when they came up to visit. And Augustus, St. Gaudens, writes, "We didn't change our mind, Hetty did." Now, this is just another indication of how important families were, couples and families, and the life of the colony was imbued with a great deal of enthusiasm and enjoyment of each other. And there were different philosophies of art, but you know, if you've got 12 children in one family and 5 in another and 7 in another family, it's going to be very hard to institute the rules of an arts colony. And they didn't have those restrictions that were true in some of the other arts colonies where you had to follow certain patterns. And up here, the only 2 rules that I've come across so far, and John is the distinguished superintendent for many years at St. Gaudens, could probably tell you some more, but the 2 that I've been most interested in, one was that you never went to visit a friend until after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because they were painting or sculpting or doing something else and they didn't want to be disturbed. And the other was Thomas Dewing saying, "I think all the women should wear white dresses because it looks so beautiful against the green." So those are the only 2 that I've recently come across, but maybe John can give you a few more. So let's go ahead. St. Gaudens went on to do the Massachusetts 54th, which you see up on the left. That was the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial, the first black regiment in the Civil War, Robert Gould Shaw being from Boston and white, and most of them slaughtered when they were put into action the first time, which was in the attack on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. On the right is the sculpture which was called Lincoln the Man, and is now most often called Standing Lincoln, and the St. Gaudens National Historic Site just got one of its own in bronze that was opened this summer, which is pretty spectacular. So if we go ahead, we're just going to take a brief look at who the artists were that were this beginning group. Because after 1916, things change. They change rather radically in the Cornish colony. Frederick McMonnies was the assistant to St. Gaudens, and he came up that first summer in 1885. His wife was also an artist. They ended up going to France and studying at Giverny. They actually bought a house there. They divorced in 1909, and she married another artist named Low, L-O-W, but they did not, they stayed here at the very beginning, in the beginning years, but they were not here at the colony all the way through for sure. The pan of Rohalen may be something similar to what you've seen of his, and you will find pieces by him and by his wife in the American wing in the garden area, the atrium. That's the Nathan Hale, which has a good deal of importance historically to us, and it's of interest the way he renders it. And I was interested when my students, in fact, one of the students that's here from Osher, said that she thought that it had a sort of frippery to it that was missing from St. Gaudens, that the details were a little, a little more fastidious, if you will, or just more like arabesques instead of like the clear classical, neoclassical details of St. Gaudens. We go ahead. This is Thomas Dewing. The one below is Summer and includes a portrait of his wife and of one of his mistresses. He had 2 mistresses among the wives of the Cornish colony. You may be interested that at some point he sort of leaves, and we've decided in my class that maybe everybody was glad to see him go. In any case, the one on the right is the lute. You may remember that in the town of Cornish there was a perfectionist. It's more like a cult than a religion. And the concept was, we don't have to worry about what Jonathan Edwards says. We are not spiders over the fires of hell. We were born with grace. And guess what? All of these rules that we have to follow, we don't need to follow. We could just look at our hearts. And they had a church in what is the little town hall over by the school. And one of their ideas was, marriage is not necessary. As many partners as you'd like, that's good, because you're good from the start. So, fortunately, we didn't get too much of that from Thomas Dewing. Maria Dewing, and she did pronounce her name Maria, was his wife. In some ways, I think her paintings are even better, although we know Thomas Dewing because he was such a good friend of Henry Freer, who built the Freer Gallery in Washington, which was designed by Charles Platt. But Maria Dewings are really gorgeous. George DeForest Brush came here and put up a teepee on St. Gaudens land. Stayed here for a while. He was particularly interested in Native Americans from the West. Eventually he leaves here. He does a couple of talks down in Dublin and ends up defecting to the Dublin colony and says many unpleasant things about the Cornish colony when he leaves, but we won't pay any mind to that. Let's go ahead. This is Henry Oliver Walker, and as you can see, one of the portraits on the left. I'm looking for you to just get a feel for what their artwork is like without too much dilly-dallying around. He did many of the murals at the Library of Congress. The bottom one is the Adonis from the Library of Congress. And if we go ahead, his wife was also an artist. Charles Platt's etching is on the left. He studied etching with Maxfield Parrish's father, Stephen Parrish. These are done in order of how they came to the Cornish colony. You're seeing them in chronological order as they arrived. And then on the right is John White Alexander. That's he himself down there on the bottom right. This is a landscape of Cornish, New Hampshire. And we'll go ahead, you can see why he was very popular for portraits, because he didn't do static portraits. He did these relatively attractive, actually, out of proportion certainly, but very sensuously beautiful portraits of women. Let's go ahead. This is Stephen Parrish's etching. He came in 1891 following Charles Platt. It was not all friends of St. Gaudens who came. It was friends of other friends of other friends. So it went out in circles. On the right is Henry Prelwitz. You can see he starts with Lotus and Laurel in a style that is not unlike Thomas Dewing's. But then he does some more interesting things. This one down on the right is called Storm Coming Mother and Child, Cornish, New Hampshire. And I think is far more interesting than what was derivative. This is Edith Prelwitz. On the left is the Book and the Rose. Here is Edith Prelwitz and her husband, and on the right is a Cornish landscape. On the left is Herbert Adams. It's meditation. It's a sculpture. Adeline Adams wrote poetry and criticism, and on the left, rather. And then on the right are, these are both by Kenyon Cox, but Louise Cox also was an artist. On the left is his portrait of his wife, and on the bottom right is St. Gaudens painting at the Met. This is Lucia Fairchild Fuller, and I see my friend who lives in their house is here, just arrived. Am I not right? Yeah, you are here. And Henry Brown Fuller and Lucia Fairchild Fuller came here in 1897. She was a well-respected artist of miniature portraits before they married. Her one on the left is by a clear fountain. They were the only ones with a swimming pool in the Cornish colony, and there's a very famous notation in one of the original writings saying we went to a swimming pool party at the Fullers. There were 35 of us and only one bathing suit. And on the right is Illusions by Henry Brown Fuller. Henry Brown Fuller was probably less celebrated among their friends. She actually had to support herself and the children with interior decorating for a period of time. So these were ordinary people, but they were families. They were husbands and wives and children. And we go ahead, another one here. This is Maxfield Parish by Kenyon Cox, the portrait on the left, upper left. And these are three from the Italian villas in their gardens that Parrish did in 1903, which marks a seismic change in his art. For one thing, color reproductions in printing begins at the turn of the century, so he's capable of doing, instead of doing black and white illustrations quite so much, with a colored cover to a magazine, he's able to do color illustrations, and he develops a technique of doing glazing with different layers of shellac. And guess what? After the turn of the century, they get the yellow out of shellac, and it becomes a clear shellac. And so his colors become very vibrant, changes his artwork. You can see, if you've seen the ones he did of illustrations, you're used to seeing lines, and you can see where it goes after the turn of the century. On the left is Willard Metcalf, and what does that say, 1809? What did you say, 1909? I think I'm just testing you to make sure you're awake today. He came to the Cornish colony in 1909. He lived off of Daniels Road. The one on the left is Cornish Hills in Windsor. Now you and I know that's not Cornish Hills. That's a Scutney in the distance. And on the bottom is Indian Summer, Vermont. Clearly that's a Scutney. In the background as well. So the artists, it wasn't that they were trying to record exactly what Cornish looked like, they were inspired by what they saw around them. In 1916, they were invited to do a show at Dartmouth, and it was the only show done like this at that time. It was a Cornish Colony art show. It was in 5 rooms. This is in the Little Theater. It's the only photograph I can find. Again, maybe John or Tim could know of some other ones, but it's the only one I've been able to find of the show. It was in the alumni magazine at Dartmouth. Underneath here, you'll see that it was January was the show, marking a culmination of these artists' families that had lived together and thrived by their interactions with each other. And in March was the town meeting, where the town voted to accept the gift of the stage, and that gift was they would build the foundation, and then Howard Hart would pay for the rest. And then on August 11th of 1916, Ruth's grandmother, Louise Saunders Perkins' play, The Woodland Princess, was put on the stage set, and it was the first production. Thanks for listening.
Our next speaker comes back to us from Philadelphia, the former director of the Hood Museum at Dartmouth, now the George Widener Director and CEO at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. We are very happy to have Timothy Rupp with us tonight. I want to, just before he begins his presentation, to let you know after he completes his presentation, we'll be taking the screen down and we will have some music from Josh Hall. And we ask your patience just for that small transition before we continue with our next speaker.
Thank you, and good evening. My purpose tonight is not to discuss Parrish's stage set in any detail. It, as you will see, is a rural landscape with painted borders, with wings, painted wings, as has been noted, and of course a wonderful backdrop with Mount Scottney as its dominant feature. All rendered in cassine, a water-soluble milk-based paint that had long been used in the theater. But rather, I'd like to put this set and the stage for which it was made in context. I'd like to start in doing so with a prologue by talking about the stage in this building and its construction a century ago. As you've heard, it was William Howard Hart who set things in motion. And here I quote from an application to include this town hall and its stage on the National Register of Historic Places. And partly this has been mentioned already, but it's worth repeating. At the March 1916 town meeting, William Howard Hart, a Plainfield resident and landscape artist of the Cornish Colony, proposed that the town appropriate $300 to add to the Plainfield Town Hall a stage for amateur talent, plays with the condition that Hart would finance the cost of constructing the stage addition, excluding foundation work, but including staging and equipment. Hart also paid for professional scene painters to reproduce a Maxfield Parish design onto a backdrop and stage wings. Upon completion in 1917, and to quote again something that's already been mentioned, but bears repeating, it was said to be the best stage north of Boston. It doesn't say how many stages there were north of Boston. I'll leave that for someone else to find out. So to begin, the first decades of the early 20th century witnessed a remarkable number of changes in the American theater. Among the most significant of these was the emergence of the community theater, a place where talented amateurs could come together and share their interests in acting in the theater with others. Here on the screen you see an image of Elliott Hall, the home of the Footlight Club, founded in the late 1870s, which claims to be the oldest community theater in the country. Now, the community theater is something we now take for granted, really first took root in this country nearly a century ago. That is to say, around the time that this stage was built and the set painted for it. Plainfield and this stage played a small but important role in this development, thanks to figures like Hart, Parrish, and others like dramatist and Cornish resident Percy Mackay, I don't think has been mentioned tonight, who in 1909 published a book entitled The Civic Theater, in which he described this new movement as a necessary counteractive to the commercial theater. and also something that might, here I quote, produce the conscious awakening of a people to self-government in the activities of its leisure, end quote. Next, please. Now, this is not the only profound change that was occurring in contemporary theater at the time, and that is to say, the community theater. There were many other things going on, and another change, the development of a different and more innovative approach to the experience of the theater, the presentation of plays, was reflected in the many new and radically different designs for theater buildings and stages in this country and across Europe that were published by forward-thinking architects and theater reformers in the teens and 20s of the last century, let's say the 1910s and 1920s. Here is but one example. The new auditorium and theater designed by the Austrian-American architect and stage designer Joseph Urban for the New School in New York in 1927. Just one of any number of examples I could show of architects rethinking the theater at the time and imagining how it could change in new and progressive ways. Could I have the next, please? Changing theater was also reflected in radical innovations at this time in stage design, advanced by a talented young generation of artists in this country and abroad, who saw in the contemporary theater a welcome opportunity for experimentation and innovation. Among these was the young Harvard graduate Robert Edmund Jones, who designed this expressionist-inspired stage set for a staging of Shakespeare's Macbeth in New York in 1921. Next, please. And it could be seen likewise, although in an entirely different form, in the lushly colored pictorial stage sets of Joseph Urban, designed in the 1920s for both the Ziegfeld Follies and the Metropolitan Opera. Here a scene from Wagner's Parsifal, presented at the Met in 1920. If, with its heightened colors, lush landscape elements, and view into the distance, it strikes you as bearing a relationship with Parrish's own landscape paintings, there's a good reason for that. So, the addition of a century ago of the stage to Plainfield's Town Hall and the creation of a painted backdrop, wings, and borders designed by Parrish to decorate the stage stood at the very beginning of a broad trend. The new movement, it was simply called by many, that resulted in the revitalization of many aspects of the American theater, as well as to its democratization and activities, such as those of community theaters across the country. They would become, as Percy Mackay had hoped, a prominent feature of American civic life. Next, please. We're there already. Okay, now, on to the matter at hand. Let's begin with a picture of an artist at work, which Maxfield Parrish made as a cover image for Life magazine in January 1925 in what he called his odds and ends style, often reserved for the humorous treatment of the subject. In this case, I think it's fair to say the artist himself. Many commentators have said if you look at the profile and squint a bit, you see Maxfield Parrish. Parrish certainly knew how to have fun and to indulge in a bit of fantasy, even at his own expense. Next, please. As did his successor, as this country's most beloved and successful illustrator, Norman Rockwell, seen here in his triple self-portrait of 1960, which likewise shows the artist at work and attempts happily to make a serious subject a little less so. Next, please. I'm pleased to be here with you this evening to celebrate the centennial of Maxfield Parrish stage set in our town hall, not only as an occasional resident of Plainfield. I don't get up here as often as I would like, but try to do so as much as I can, but also as the director of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. What you see on the screen is the wonderful design executed in glass mosaic done by Tiffany that Parrish designed for the lobby of the headquarters of the Curtis Publishing Company in Philadelphia in 1916, the very same year that our stage set was painted. There is, of course, a family resemblance between the two landscapes, but that is not my reason for showing Dream Garden as this work is titled. Rather, it's to underscore the fact that Parrish was born and educated in Philadelphia, and it was his experience there as a student and then as a young practicing artist that set the direction he would take later in his career. Born into a family of Quakers, he was the son of Stephen Parrish, has already been mentioned, would later become a key figure in the revival of etching in this country, and of course a member of the Cornish colony as well. Young Parrish, again growing up in Philadelphia, attended that great Quaker institution of higher learning, Haverford College, where he pursued his love of architecture, but apparently very little else, and after a few years decided to focus on developing his talents elsewhere as an artist by studying at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He received there a thorough training in studio practice and came of age as an artist at the very beginning of what would become the golden age of illustration in this country, and featured such great and diverse talents as, next please, before we go on, if you could go back a bit. This is a poster that for the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts show on posters that Parrish did just a year after he graduated in 1896. Next please. But I was about to talk about the great age of American illustration that featured such remarkable talents as Will Bradley, Edward Penfield, and Charles Dana Gibson, to name just a few. Here on the screen, a beautiful and strikingly graphic cover design by Bill Bradley for the Chapbook, an American literary magazine published between 1894 and 1898. Now, Parrish, as I mentioned a moment ago, finished his schooling at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts around 1895, and then set out to find his way at what seems to have been, in retrospect, a watershed moment in the history of American illustration. Thanks to the rapid growth at this point in time of publishing, especially in magazines, and thanks to significant improvements in printing technologies that allowed for the use of color, as has been mentioned, and enabled the much more sophisticated reproduction of pictorial tone and texture, which had hitherto been a rather limited field of specialization. Illustration became rich with new possibilities for young artists such as Parrish. Next, please. Philadelphia played a central role in this development. Here, a work from 1898 by Howard Pyle. It is the frontispiece for a novel called The Ruby of Kishmore. Pyle was the Dean of Illustrators in the city, that is Philadelphia, and is a member of the faculty of Drexel University, a great mentor for many younger artists, including Parrish. In fact, it's often noted that Parrish not only went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, but then spent some time studying at Drexel University. Apparently that wasn't the case. It seems that he went to Pyle, showed him his work, and Pyle said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing I can teach you. Go out and get some work." Next, please. And here, an image of one of the heroes of the Trojan War, Ulysses, after he returns to his palace in Ithaca after 10 years of wandering. This painted for a 1939 edition of the Odyssey and illustrated by the talented artist N.C. Wyeth, perhaps best known today as the father of Andrew Wyeth. So it was the work of Wyeth, Pyle, Parrish, and his contemporaries that opened up an extraordinary array of possibilities for American illustration and paved the way for figures such as, next please, again I'm going to cite Norman Rockwell. Here's a wonderful image, a cover that he did for the Saturday Evening Post in December of 1939, but also beyond Rockwell to the illustrators of Marvel Comics today or today's graphic novels. All of this is a very rich and very important background in the history of American illustration, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. Next, please. Now, Parrish's talent was such that within a year of graduating from the Pennsylvania Academy, again in 1895, he was already receiving a steady stream of commissions to illustrate books, periodicals, advertisements, and posters. His abilities, a gifted draftsman, and as a creator of compelling images, were evident right from the very start, as can be seen in this black and white rendering of Humpty Dumpty sitting on his wall for a retelling of Mother Goose rhymes in prose published in 1897 by L. Frank Baum, who, as many of you know, a few years later would go on to write The Wizard of Oz. This was, in fact, Parrish's first illustrated work. And here you see, right at the beginning of his career, some of the hallmarks of his work as an illustrator. His habit of creating a precise frame around many of his compositions, his tendency to compress the distance between foreground and background, and his talent for the rendering of fanciful architecture. Next, please. Here's another picture, also in black and white, from the first illustrated edition of the English writer Kenneth Graham's volume of stories entitled The Golden Age, published in 1900, with a set of lovely images by Parrish. Indeed, I think they're some of his finest work. In this, we can clearly see how quickly he moved beyond a reliance upon line and flat planes to what we might call a more pictorial emphasis on tone and texture. In other words, he begins working even before color is available for printing. He begins working in the idiom of the painter rather than that of the draftsman. Such an image also demonstrates how fascinating Parrish was, again, right from the very beginning of his career, with childhood as a realm of innocence, of discovery, of the imagination. Next, please. This was, in fact, the focus here announced in the title page of this book written by Kenneth Graham, who a few years later would go on to write his enduring classic, The Wind in the Willows. Next, please. And it was a theme that Parrish, again, childhood and all of its imaginative possibilities, that Parrish explored in many of his early illustrations, including what is perhaps his most famous of these, The Dinky Bird, drawn for Eugene Field's Poems of Childhood, which was published in 1904. This was indeed the first book to feature full-color illustrations of Parrish's paintings. Thereafter, the use of lush color and theatrical lighting effects became an important part of Parrish's work and an essential ingredient in his artistic success. Next, please. One of my favorite pictures. This image and illustration for Dream Days, also by Kenneth Graham and published in 1902, is intended, before we go on, to serve as a reminder to us that Parrish's image of childhood was always suffused with a sense of fun and very good humor, as in this Ode to Chocolate, published long before Roald Dahl struck the same note with his children's book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Parrish was there first. Next, please. This fascination with childhood, with the realm of learning about the world through make-believe and fantasy, through, in a phrase, the imagination, was in fact widespread at the time, and can be found in the work of many other artists. This is Parrish, a work by Parrish called The Lantern Bearers for Collier's Magazine, published in December 1910. Next, please. And here, to compare with it, a work by the great American expatriate painter, John Singer Sargent, entitled Carnation, Lily Rose, today in the collection of the Tate Gallery, and about which I am very envious. It's a wonderful picture. So this is done this is a painting that Sargent did in 1885-86 of young girls in a garden playing in the evening with Chinese lanterns. And you can see the community spirit between the Parrish illustration and this work of about 25 years before. Or to cite an entirely different example, next please, the work of the German modernist painter Paul Klee. Now, what I've shown you on the screen here is a work by N.C. Wyeth, a cover for the Ladies' Home Journal from 1922. So this idea of childhood as a realm of the imagination was a common theme in the work of many illustrators at that time, including Wyeth, who contributed this picture to the cover of the Ladies' Home Journal in 1922. One important and familiar variation on this examination of the world of childhood, of words, on this theme was the capacity of words, of literature, to trigger the imagination and to help us visualize worlds that lay beyond the day-to-day experience. So here you see a young boy who's reading a book, looks up, and in the back, of course, is a picture that he's formed in his mind of the scene in the book itself. Wyeth himself took a kind of literal approach to rendering this relationship between word and image, and the imagination, of course. And next, Parrish took a slightly more jocular approach to this subject. This is a cover illustration for Collier's Magazine by Parrish that he designed in 1908 called School Days, which is was a way, I suppose, of reminding his young readers that before they were able to take flights of fancy through literature, they had to indeed learn their ABCs. Next, please. This same impulse, again, of the relationship between word and image and the capacity of one to trigger the imagination and to create visions of other things, can be found in Parrish's splendid illustrations made in the 1920s for The Knave of Hearts, a children's play written by Louise Saunders, the wife of the great editor of Scribner's Maxwell Perkins, both of whom, as you heard, were members of the Cornish colony. Parrish, surprisingly, did not provide sets for this play, but rather the illustrations for its publication, and it was published in the mid-1920s. Now, although Parrish did not focus much of his energy on the theater, it was, as you'll hear, I think, later in this evening's program, an integral part of life in the Cornish colony. It was the living counterpart, the marriage of word and image, that motivated the very best of Parrish's work. This idea, I think, is essential, again, the relationship between text and image, to understanding the significance of the stage set that he created for Plainfield's Town Hall, and appreciating the continuing importance to its continuing importance, rather, to the cultural history of this community. The stage set for this building was, of course, created for The Woodland Princess, a children's play authored in 1909 by none other than the same Louise Saunders. Next, please. Now, I would argue that our understanding of Parrish as a landscape painter is also critical to an appreciation of the stage set. Although he dedicated himself almost entirely to the painting of landscapes after the mid-1920s, this had been an important part of his practice from the very start of his career, this being the painting of landscapes. We can see this in Parrish's early book illustrations, as well as in the illustrations he provided for many of America's great magazines during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. This lovely Italian-inspired view, published in the Century magazine in August 1904, being a very, very good example. Next, please. Another fine early example of Parrish's work in landscape was the wonderful series of views of Arizona and other parts of the Southwest that he was commissioned to paint for a multi-part article published in Century magazine from May through November of 1902. He spent some time in the Southwest at that point, in part recovering from a bout of tuberculosis. This experience of the light of the Southwest and the grand vistas he experienced there clearly contributed to his development of a palette of bright and luminous colors for his landscape, what indeed he is known for today. Next, please. Now, this is another view from that series. The early development of Parrish's taste for bright color and spectacular lighting effects can best be seen in the splendid Technicolor view of mountains and a river valley from that same article. And again, this is 1902. Next, please. Now, lest you think Parrish was alone in this, he was not. He was very much of his time, and I think it's important to understand that context. So again, Parrish's approach to the composition, lighting, and coloration of his landscapes, although distinctive, was by no means unique. Rather, it reflects the widespread influence of symbolist painting at this time, which favored a palette of colors that is far from naturalistic and could be found in the work of many artists of the day, including that of Parrish's good friend, the great architectural renderer of this period, Jules Guérin, who published this view of a book entitled The Chateau of Touraine in 1906. Next, please. Here we come back to Italian gardens. Now, the idea of landscape, how we shape it, its relationship to the built environment, and its very cultural meanings was a prominent topic in both artistic and literary circles in this country in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Joe has already made mention of this. This, too, was an important part of the context in which Parrish worked and was reflected in his own artistic development. This is also a moment, again, around the turn of the 20th century in American life when we look to the past in architecture as well as landscape design, not only to understand our own heritage, but also to determine how to shape it in modern conditions, or shape it to rather modern conditions and needs. The colonial revival in architecture was one such example, and so too was the fascination at this time with the Italian garden, which became the subject of study for many artists and architects interested in landscape design at that moment. Parrish participated in this development by contributing illustrations to the study of the celebrated American writer Edith Wharton made of Italian villas and gardens and published in 1905. Here, if memory serves, is a view of a Roman garden that Parrish created for this very work. Next, please. Now, in this, he and Wharton were following a path already established by another member of the Cornish colony, Charles Platt, a talented etcher, painter, architect, landscape designer, who had 10 years before, that is in the mid-1890s, published a slender but influential book on gardens in Renaissance and Baroque Italy. Here, a watercolor of his that served as the frontispiece for this publication, which was widely influential and is really credited with starting the vogue for Italian gardens in this country. Next, please. Now, this was also part of Parrish's family life in New Hampshire, as we can see in this view of the lush garden of Northcote, the home of his father, Stephen, in Cornish, designed by the distinguished Philadelphia architect Wilson Eyre in 1893. Next, please. And it was part of contemporary culture, as exemplified in Charles Platt's design for a house and gardens entitled High Court for Annie Lazarus in Cornish in 1890. The house itself, which you see on the screen, was a simple and fairly modest affair, both in its design and its scale. What made it distinctive was Platt's siting of the house, the placement of the building in the landscape, and his framing of the views from the house. Next, please. What you see on the screen here is a painting that Charles Platt created around this time of the gardens at High Court, on which, again, if memory serves, he collaborated with Ellen Shipman. And this is a view out from the house into the gardens immediately in front of the house, and then beyond, of course, into the Connecticut River Valley. Now, for those who know Platt's work, and I suspect there are many in this audience, you will recognize a familiar approach. The extension of the house into a formal garden adjacent to the house, thus creating a kind of outdoor room, if you will, which was geometric in plan and intended to frame the view to the natural landscape beyond, a view that in many of Platt's designs was terminated by the dominant feature of this part of the Upper Valley, Mount Scotty. And I think this is precisely what Platt meant to tell you when he painted, or tell us rather, when he painted this picture and took the point of view he did, looking again out from the house into this formal garden and then beyond into the Upper Valley. Next, please. Now, this formula, a conflation or bringing together of near and far, with a figure or an architectural element or both in the foreground and a romantic views of the hills and mountains beyond, would serve as the basis for much of Parrish's work in landscape, from book illustrations to advertisements like the one you see on the screen. Next, please, to the highly colored, photographically realistic landscapes that secured his reputation as one of the most popular artists of his time. After the mid-1920s, when Parrish made the transition from commercial work to focusing on painting landscapes of a more or less full-time basis, he continued to elaborate on the successful formula, but also to explore the landscape he had come to know and love here in Plainfield, where he had lived since 1897, so more than 20 years. This aspect of his work can be seen in this painting of 1948 entitled Hunt Farm, which is now in the collection of Dartmouth College. Next, please. So the design Parrish contributed to the new stage, added to the Plainfield Town Hall in 1916, what we have come together to celebrate tonight, is emblematic of what Parrish cherished most in his experience of nature. Both the landscapes that we shape to our own purposes, like the gardens of Charles Platt or Ellen Shipman, and the landscapes more broadly defined, more broadly defined as setting and frame for human activity. It was, of course, this design intended as a setting for the production of Louis Saunders' The Woodland Princess, which inaugurated this stage. But this design was much more than that. For Parrish, it was also a summation of his experience of a specific place and a visual hymn to the town of Plainfield, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, by that time had been his home for nearly 20 years. If you have any doubts about this, listen to the description of the view from his own house that Platt described in a letter that he wrote to a friend in April of 1932, and I want to end on this. And here I'm quoting directly. This is again of the view from his own house, just down the street. There is a blue distance, infinite distance, a sense of great space and glorious things in store for you, if only you go a little further to grasp it all. Takes your breath away a little, as there seems to be just blue forms ahead and no floor. Then you come upon the lower terrace, and over a level stone wall, you see it all. Hills and woodlands, high pastures, and beyond them, more and bluer hills. From New Hampshire on one side and Vermont on the other, come tumbling down into the broad valley of the Connecticut, with one grand mountain over it all. Thank you.
Again. Before I introduce our next speaker, it's kind of hard to concentrate. I so appreciate what I've learned tonight. I'm just loving this. I just want to say that I feel like I have a friendship through time with Louis Saunders after directing The Knave of Hearts with my own children, including my son here, who was Blue Hose or Yellow Hose? Yellow Hose, and Plainfield's David Cassidy was our Blue Hose. They were featured on the cover of the Valley News, for those of you who saw about a year ago in the summertime. And the more I learned about her, the more I related to her as a woman who had a life here and connection to New York and was raising children and doing art with children. I've been so fortunate to do drama with children in this community, some of whom have historic ties to the colony. But I fancied us a continuation of this great tradition. I also loved discovering her poetry, which all of our performers memorized some of her poems, and my kids were excited to discover that some of them were formal sonnets. And the children were in full costume, Knave of Hearts costumes, and they were in the gardens at St. Gaudens. And before our production, any visitor to St. Gaudens who approached was entertained with a performance of one of Louise Saunders' poems. So I'm thrilled to have Ruth King Porter here, granddaughter of Louise Saunders, and Louise, as has been said, wrote the first play to ever be performed here, The Woodland Princess. Welcome, Ruth.
Thanks. I can't really give a speech about her, but I did want everybody to know what she was like. We all called her Wheezy. We could never have called her Grandma. She was just completely ungrandmotherish. She was an actress. She was always an actress. And she acted, she grew up with lots of money, and I think they might have even had a little theater in the back of their house, or anyway, she was always acting, and then she decided to get married to Max Perkins, and he made her promise that she would not be an actress. That's the way people did things then, I guess, and she did promise. And so she started writing plays, and she wrote plays, and she wrote a lot of poetry. She wrote beautiful poetry, and she was really good at writing sonnets. But she was just such an, I remember she came to visit me when I was about 8, and she wanted to play charades. She always wanted to play charades, and none of us really knew how very well, but we would try. And I remember just thinking, she's a little boy and an old lady, and how can that be? Both at once? I just couldn't understand it. That's what kind of an actress she was. But she couldn't be an actress, so she wrote, and she wrote these, and she insisted that her children all take part in these plays that she wrote. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask me, I'd love to answer them. I'd much rather do that. I can't really give a speech. Okay, well, I'll tell you a story about her when she was about 15. Her mother died when she was about that age, and her father was an important businessman, and he would go on these business trips, and he would take one or the other of his daughters with him. And so he went to Mexico, and he took Wheezy, and he didn't think it was safe for her to be wandering around the streets when he had to be in these business meetings. So he said to her, you have to stay in your room in the hotel. And he came back later on that day, and she had invented this system. She had a basket and a long string, and she would lower the basket out the window, and all the street vendors were there offering her their wares, and she would put money in the basket, and they would put things in the basket, and she was having a great day shopping. But she didn't break her promise. Yes.
How did she meet your grandmother?
They grew up together in the same town, in Plainfield, New Jersey. And she invited him for a weekend, and I think there were a lot of other people invited too, to a place that they had on the New Jersey shore. And when he came home, he'd forgotten his pajamas, and he wrote her a letter and asked her to send them. And she didn't find the pajamas, but she found a bathing suit, and she sent it to him, and she said, all remains, but has been changed into something rich and strange, which is from The Tempest. She was fascinating to all of us, but not grandmotherly.
Can you kind of compare her to Laura Linney's portrayal in the movie?
Oh, that's really why I'm here tonight. Because that movie, Genius, came out this summer. Maybe some of you have seen it. And they made her into kind of an ordinary mom. She wasn't a bit like that. So I kind of wanted to set the record straight.
Do you know anything about the Woodland Princess in particular? Where that came from, or?
No, I don't, but she loved fairies and things like that, so, yeah. And she wrote the Knave of Hearts, too. Yeah.
Did she go back and forth between New York and the French colony, or was she mostly upstairs?
No, they only came in the summer. Yeah.
And stayed with
They stayed, they never had a house of their own up here. They sometimes stayed in one of their relatives' houses, and sometimes they rented a house up here. But they came every summer. It was my mother's favorite thing. But they never lived here in the winter.
They're wonderful stories about their fathers coming up on the train and
Yeah.
Friday afternoons all
Yeah,
together.
there were lots of trains then. It was really nice. And she was terribly generous. I know a lady who was a little girl and she was at a cocktail, her parents were giving a cocktail party and Wheezy and Max were there and she admired Wheezy's bracelet and Wheezy took it right off her arm and gave it to this little girl. And the girl's mother said, "You can't do that, you've got to give it back." And Wheezy said, "No, this is between me and her." And it belongs to her, and she's always kept it on her desk. She's an editor, a children's book editor now, and she keeps it always on her desk. Yes. But she's very different than she is in the Genius movie. And I have some pictures of her too, but I didn't think about putting them on the computer, so I just have them on paper if anybody wants to see them. And her books too.
You said she wrote a book of her plays too, right?
I have a book of her plays, yeah. You can get it on Amazon.
Oh, kidding.
Yeah. And the last long thing she wrote was called Pauline, and it was about Napoleon's sister, Pauline. Max loved Napoleon. And she wrote this long, complicated play about Pauline. Thanks.
I hope everybody, after our next speaker and the light show, will have cake and there will be an opportunity to circulate and ask questions to our speakers then as well. Our last speaker is my very own uncle, David Taylor, who grew up as a neighbor of Maxfield Parish. And David, would you come on up? Thank you.
Certainly a pleasure to be here tonight and share a few things with you. I performed on this stage in a number of plays, played basketball on this floor, attended town meetings here. I hate to say it, but my friends and I played tag, running behind this set. We all are very thankful that a group of people in this town sought to preserve it, and it's what we have today. To put myself and Brother Steve, who's right here, in history and time, our grandmother was a member of the colony and built her house on Freeman Road about the same time that Mr. Parrish built his house. Our folks met because of a play on this stage. And during the Depression era, when people in theater were encouraged to do plays to help people get through the Depression. So that's an interesting sideline. So I'm going to talk a bit about the fact that, yes, we lived on Freeman Road as neighbors of the Parishes. The house, the Oaks, as he called it, was just across the sheep pasture and down the hill, a short walk for us. And yes, I did go down there and visit. And I want to just get straight. He was called Fred for a number of years, especially when he was young, and I suppose by some people in the colony. Maxfield, not often, unless it were some very close friends. We called him Mr. Parrish. He was not he was friendly enough, not awfully formal, but he didn't invite informality. He was happy to be called Mr. Parrish, I think, by hearing people in town, by people who worked for him, called him Mr. Parrish. So it's an interesting sideline to this. And we got used to it. We always called him Mr. Parrish. So as I said, we lived across the sheep pasture, and occasionally I'd walk down maybe to check on a sheep fence or something, and Mr. Parrish would be out on his lawn. And sure enough, I was there the other day, and Mr. Parrish was out on his lawn, and we talked a few minutes. And I had received an invitation to come and talk about a stage set. And I said to Mr. Parrish, you know, there's going to be a little celebration, and it would be wonderful if you could come. And he looked at me strangely. He said, you know, Mr. Taylor, I don't make public appearances. I'm not happy doing that type of thing. I said, I know, Mr. Parrish, but this is a wonderful time, and we'd love to have you. He said, well, all right, for a neighbor, I'll do it. And so the time for the celebration came. And tonight, I'm so happy to have Mr. Maxfield Parrish here. And would you give him a warm welcome? He's going to be right. Mr. Parrish has slowed down a bit, a little bit of arthritis in his hands, but he said, I still managed to turn out a few things, and maybe tonight I'll put the finishing touches on something here for you. Welcome, Mr. Parrish. As I said, Freeman Road is in Plainfield, but it was considered part of the Cornish colony, much to disappointment of a lot of people in Plainfield, I have to say. But the house went up 1898, the same time that my folks' house went up. And he picked a spot which arguably could be termed the best view of Mount Ascutney of any place among the colony people. It certainly is a beautiful spot there. He called it the Oaks because of the beautiful oak trees that grew there and still grow there today near what is still a house similar to what Mr. Parrish built in 1898. We saw him occasionally, and as I said, we pastured our sheep, and Mr. Parrish wanted us to pasture our sheep near his place because the sheep helped to keep the landscape clear of trees. And that was a big interest of his because he had this wonderful view of Mount Ascutney. And so we did that. And, well, he, of course, married and had 4 children pretty quickly. They built the house, added on to it to accommodate a growing family. And the story goes, one day he was feeling overwhelmed. A lot of artwork to be done, and there were these children. And he went to his father, Stephen Parrish, and said, what do I do? I'm strung out, too much. The father said, well, one thing I'd do is build a studio across the way where you can go, retreat to do your art, get away from the main house. And the second thing I'd do is hire a housekeeper. Oh, all right. So he went to work. He and George Ruggles, who was a Plainfield resident, who helped him build the house, and built the studio. It was added on to over the years, became quite a collection of buildings. But he looked around, and there was some other young people in town who said they knew of a woman who might come over and help out. And sure enough, across the river from Heartland came a young lady, Sue Lumen. And some of you have probably already glanced through the book that we have supplied, but she plays a large part and helped to raise the children, and not long after she became known as Aunt Sue, and worked for Mr. Parrish for many, many, many years, and ended up, of course, being the model for much of, or she appears in many, many of Mr. Parrish's work. And I knew her, went to church here in town, and Miss Lumen came to church every Sunday. Mr. Parrish would drop her off at church every Sunday. So let me tell you a little bit about when I went down to the Oaks, had occasion to walk. The studio was where Mr. Parrish lived, really. He lived in the big house for a while, but pretty soon the studio became his primary residence. It was smaller, it was easier to heat in the winter. In the summertime, they used the big house when people came to visit. But the studio was basically his home. And we walked in on the ground level into a most marvelous shop, a machine shop, because Mr. Parrish was a fine machinist, as well as being an artist. And we wondered where he gained the talent to do so many things with metal, but he was a fine, fine machinist and produced many, many items in bronze and other metals, which many of them survive today. But when he built the house, no ordinary hinges. He made them himself out of bronze. Door latches, all types of places in the house where metal latches and things were needed. He made them on the machines there in his machine shop. You walked in, there was a slight smell of the machine oil. Overhead were big belts and pulleys and things running these machines. And he knew how to do it, how to shape things, how to turn things with metal lathes. And then beyond the metal shop was a wood shop. And of course he made picture frames and did other things with wood. He was a very, very talented man with his hands. And of course was doing his art as well. I've often wondered, one slip of one of his hands on one of those cutting machines, I always say, what would have happened? But he never did. He had good hands the rest of his life, pretty much. And then a little bit farther back on this first level, ground level, was the most extraordinary system he set up for his firewood. he had built this wonderful track system into his basement with a little railroad car. And from outside, you could pile the wood onto this little cart and push it into the basement along these tracks. But then, once you got the wood in the basement, you had to get it upstairs. He built a little elevator that you could pile sticks of wood, and up it went to the next level. Because upstairs was the living quarters of the studio, and that too was a most unique experience to visit. A huge fireplace, big fireplace where you had a fire going probably, 7, 8 months of the year, who knows. And pieces of his art decorated the walls, very unique lighting, big plush sofas. This is all from a memory of a small boy, but his had a little office. You came in, it was just a little narrow stairway that you went up to the living quarters. Off to one side was a little office that he did his paperwork and things. And then if you kept going, just a small kitchen, very small. I often wonder how Sue Lumen prepared those meals all those years in that little kitchen. And then you walk through the kitchen out to his back porch, which he loved, and where he fed the birds. He always in the winter fed the birds and took great joy in watching the birds. I remember these hanging feeders that he had. Wonderful, wonderful. So, then at another level, a slight stairway up were several small bedrooms, and then where he did his painting. And I never saw too much of that. I've only seen pictures, but that's where he spent his mornings and more, probably, doing his painting. But it was a tidy, efficient living space. But across the yard was the big house, which really remained after the children had reached college age, I guess. Not much went on in the big house anymore. And it was Maxfield, or Mr. Parrish, and Sue Lumen over in the studio, and that's where he produced so many of his beautiful things. Now, just to tell you a couple of visits I've made. Went down one day with a box of hand-picked raspberries. I went in the shop door, up a little stairway to the entrance to the upper level, bang, bang, bang on the door, and I heard steps, and pretty soon the door opened, and there was Miss Lumen. And yes, what can I do for you? I said, I've got some berries I've picked. I was wondering if Mr. Parrish would like to buy some berries. And she turned around. Mr. Parrish, there's a young boy here with berries. Shall we buy them? Of course, he yelled back, of course, buy the berries from the young boy. That happened on occasion. I, in fact, had a few times where I did odd jobs for him, shoveling snow, maybe a couple of winters, I forget exactly. Paid me with a check, a couple of dollars, $3. And of course, a young kid, the temptation to cash those checks and get the money was overpowering. I wish I'd saved those checks. But I didn't. Anyway, another time, my dad, we were doing some sort of project around the farm. We needed a wrench, a certain wrench. Go down and see Mr. Parrish. He'll have the wrench. Oh, off I went. Knocked on the door. Miss Lumen again. Yes, what is it? I need a certain wrench, and I thought maybe Mr. Parrish would have it. Mr. Parrish, there's a young boy here who needs a wrench. Down he comes the stairs. And we go into the machine shop, sure enough, he's got the wrench there. Interesting fact about Mr. Parrish, he loved to whistle. He loved to whistle. And as he made his way around the machine shop and looking, and we checked drawers and things, he was whistling a little tune. And that was, I remember it so well, that little bit of whistling that he did. It was just a kind of a nervous, I don't know what, but something to do while you were walking and looking and taking care of things, I guess. So, pretty good, pretty good. Let's see, I guess a little bit about the outside of the house. He had a big circular fountain out front of the house where you could, where you looked at Mount Scottney, beautiful. And a lot of those things were hard to keep up. And, but I do remember them very well, being there. There were, I think, a couple of urns still left by the time that I was growing up that were decorating the outside. He loved urns. You know. The car. I had to mention the car. He drove a Cadillac, a green Cadillac. And by the time I knew him, he was in his 80s. He didn't drive very fast, but he drove that Cadillac over to Windsor or down to Plainfield. Every 2 years, he replaced that Cadillac with a standing order up at Miller Auto in White River for a new green Cadillac. And they were hefty cars. Probably traded them in after 2 years. They probably had 2,000 miles on them. Well, that's what you did in those days, and that's what he did. So a couple of times I hitched a ride to Windsor with him, so I had a chance to ride in the green Cadillac with Mr. Parrish. And that was memorable, I have to say. So, I think, thinking back now, Mr. Parrish and so on, my last time that I saw him was when I had graduated from college and was about to go on a trip. And I had a new camera. And I said to my father, let's walk down and see if Mr. Parrish is there. Is he able to come out and see us? And so we walked down, and sure enough, he came out wearing the outfit that we always thought of him in, the blue shirt and the khaki pants. And he had a little jacket on. And I took the picture of Mr. Parrish and my father, and that picture is over in the library. And I don't think it's the last picture that was taken of him, but he still was, had a cane, and was still very cheery and was happy to see us, my father especially, come to see him. And I think already Miss Lumen had moved on by then, but it was good to see him on that day, and I'll always remember that day. So there are a few reminiscences of Mr. Parrish, and there are a lot of us here in this room who can say that they met him, talked to him, and interacted with him the way I did, but a part of history. Thank you.
The light show. wonderful speakers, and Bev and Nancy and all the organizers of this event. Thank you, Josh, for the beautiful music. And we hope that you will join us for some cake to celebrate the birthday of this wonderful set. Good night.